Okay. So looking at these images, we all probably recognize in these plants, mother and Brazilwood and little insect, kermes and coccinelle, the most used sources for reds in the European textile industry. However, there is another material that has been used for centuries as the source of another red known as lac dye. It is once again produced by insect, and more specifically by this lac insect belonging to the genus Caria, which is distributed across Asia and grouped in 29 species. The female lac insect in particular secrete a resinous substance that create all around twigs and branches of host trees where this insect live on, a sort of incrustation, this red-brown incrustation that completely cover and bed the insect. So when we look at the raw material, we do see here the wood in the middle part and then the resin, and inside all trapped the insect. And it's important to point to the fact that the female insect secrete a fluid that stay within their bodies, which is red and is full of some molecules anyway, full of some coloring properties, which are actually the source of lac dye. So when this raw material is then processed, lac dye is obtained, and it has been used for centuries in Asia, first of all, to create beautiful textile. And texts, written sources from Asia describing both lac insect and lac dye dated back to an early time. But what about lac dye in Europe? And this is what I will try to explain, to tell you today. More specifically, I would like to start from references, especially trade manuals and costume registers, and try to understand where lac dye was traded from, when was used, or anyway presence on the European market, from whom was traded, why, so if there was a certain values, and then how this color was used. So the first known reference of lac insect used for creating purple garments refer to India as the place where these insects are from. And it's dated back to the 5th century before Christ. Then at the beginning of the Christian era, there is another source, important source, is an anonymous Greek merchant describing Maharashtra and so India again, and Roman Egypt as two places where lac dye was present on the market. And in fact, in his list of commodities, he described these lacos chromatinos that might be either the raw material, the actual lac dye, or lac dye fabrics. Then, between the 11 and 13th century, there are some letters of Jewish traders from Egypt and Libya describing trades of lac dye among with other commodities from Gujarat, India, to Cairo, and from Cairo to the Iberian Peninsula. And in fact, in 1267, we have an interesting letter by King Alfonso X, limiting the use of lac dye and also indigo, Brazilwood, and kermes to the royal court. Later on, between 14th and 15th century, Genoa and Venice were two major trading centers. And here we do know from these trading manuals that lac dye was imported from the Eastern Mediterranean and then re-exported from the Western Europe and Northern Europe. And to this period of time belong an interesting source for us, this Pratica della Mercatura, where there is a interesting description of lac dye. It is actually an example of practical knowledge on this raw material. Pegolotti, the author, for example, referred to this material that that form all around branches, and to be used needed a sort of cleaning, a first cleaning to remove dirt, dust, and remainings of the wood. And then he explained the presence of two types of lac matura, so a ripe type and then an unripe type that differ, first of all, based on color. A dark red, the first one, which was actually the best one to be used, the ripe one, and a lighter version for the unripe. And then he also explained and advised other merchants to differentiate between genuine type of lac and fake one. Especially, he could either chew the source or put it in their hand, add a bit of saliva, and if it's good quality, a deep red color would appear. Later on, between the 15th and 16th century, we have information on lac dye trade from European travelers. And we do know from them that lac dye was, or the raw material stick lac, was traded from Myanmar, Thailand, and Malaysia. Once again, another source is the Portuguese physician Garcia da Horta, that published this account in the 16th century describing the Indian lac insect. However, he said that ants were the actual producer of lac dye, was actually it's not, because ants do live in proximity of this resinous material, but because they feed from some honey substance that are secreted by the insect, the lac insect, which is actually within the resin. And then in the 18th century, we have a French dyer saying that the best lac, the best material was traded in Bengal. So what we could understand from this type of sources is that stick lac, the raw material, was actually imported from Asia to Europe, that there were different different types based on the colors, based on the provenance, and based also on the hardness. One breaking better than the other. And that also, if we think about this limitation in using lac dye in the 13th century, it means that there was a value, a cultural value in for lac dye. When then we move to another type of written sources, so recipe books and treatises for using lac dye for a specific reason, we do obtain information on the technology for using lac dye as a dye stuff, so to dye textile in this case. We do have information on formulation, so which other materials, either dye stuff or mordants, let's say ingredients, were used to create a specific color. And then we could obtain information, more broad information on the culture, the society that used this dye stuff. And I will explain later on how this information support the identification of lac dye and recipe specificities in historical artifacts. So when we look into lac dye used as a source, it uses a source to create pigments, so for pigment making, we do see actually quite a lot of recipes, up to 20 recipes, spanning almost 8th century, from the 9th, 10th to the 17th century. However, when we look into the sources for dyeing practice, we see that the earliest known recipe for dyeing silk with lac dye is from the 16th century. Here it's interesting to note that almost a century before this first recipe in Genoa, the Silk Guild prohibited the use of lac dye and the commerce of lac dyed fabric, with actually severe situation, let's say, for the offenders, from fines to the destruction of the cloth. Why this is a question that I would like to discuss with you. Might have been for technical reason. We know that dyeing with lac dye was not easy, that skilled dyers were needed. In fact, because of that resin, which is part of the raw material, when in the dye bath, the cloth might get spoiled because the resin does get stuck to the fabric and would have been difficult then to remove it. But of course, political and economical reason cannot be ruled out, especially if we consider that dye stuff were expensive commodities that were traded, like in this case, from the Far East and Middle East to Europe, and necessarily and inevitably suffer from wars or other political situation that increased their price and limited their availability. And another interesting fact is that 3 centuries later, in 1741, the French dyer Antoine Janot was actually prohibited to dye. He was accused of using lac dye, which was not permitted by any regulation. And why, once again, I would like to discuss it with you and understand what the possible reason. In any case, when we look into the dyeing practice, we see from this very first recipe that silk was the fabric intended to be dyed with lac dye, mordanted with alum, and then the raw material, so stick lac, was ground, reduced in powder, and the silk put in a bag, maybe because of preventing it from getting spoiled by the resin. And then kermes was also added, probably to obtain a certain color. And then finally, the fixing bath that would last the time of a prayer. And then we go next to the other important source with recipe for dyeing with lac dye. It's in the 18th century. And this is an important period of time where a new ingredient, if we can call it like that, was invented that marked an important time in the dyeing textile industry and evolution, which is the tin mordant. This ingredient, this tin mordant, was firstly elaborated at the beginning of the 17th century by the Dutch scientist de Brel, who passed the recipe to his son-in-law that had a dye works in London. They used this tin mordant and in fact became famous for this scarlet. And then by the time other also dyers produced their own recipe for making tin mordant. So first of all, how it was made. Tin mordant is basically a chemical reaction between salt water, salt, nitric acid, and tin that was extracted from tin oxide in form of a mineral, cassiterite, that was obtained from mines in Cornwall, UK, that was at that time the main European producer. And then this reaction creates a yellowish, this is how it's described in the recipe, solution that when added into a dye bath, crimson dye bath obtained with cochineal, there is a color shift from crimson towards scarlet dye that was actually one of the most wanted color. So basically this tin mordant allow a revolution, the possibility of obtaining a color that was, as I said, wanted with a cheaper ingredient. cochineal instead of the much more expensive kermes. One example of a recipe for scarlet dyeing using lac dye and tin mordant are present in this very important archive, the Crutchley Archive, which also have 1,000 dyeing instruction and also dyed patterns. The recipe for dyeing with lac dye are dated at the beginning of the 18th century and are in Flemish. This is an interesting fact because it demonstrated, or at least it attested, that there was a transition of or circulation of knowledge between the skilled dyers from Antwerp or Bruges to those in UK. Some recipes in the Crutchley book from the 1728. We have here one recipe for obtaining scarlet, the other one to obtain a wine color. They do use best luck, but also slack luck, bad luck. So best luck and bad luck. And then they all use tartar, which is a salt which creates in the inside part of vessel that contain grapes for their fermentation and production of wine. And it has been used during the dyeing practice for centuries, a typical ingredient. And then alum, of course, the tin mordant, cochineal in one case, and in the other potash to obtain the color most wanted. There is also another recipe that is interesting because it used turmeric that was possibly used to push even more toward orangey shades, the color of scarlet. But also it has information on how to extract the dye stuff from the raw material stick lac. And in this case, it says the stick lac needs to be ground and then sieved, pour a liquor on it, might be either water of the tin, we don't know, and then put the material in a bag, this bag that comes here and there, and then squeeze it the color in a water dye bath. Later on in the 18th century, so actually a few years far from the Crutchley Archive, we have an interesting source, this French source, Hello. He was a chemist, so not actually a experienced dyer, but yet his recipe, as many other technical manual written in this century, became the reference, the basis for other works, as we can see here, that were written much often. However, it's in this case important to remember that, as I mentioned, he was mainly a chemist, not an experienced dyer, neither had practical knowledge on dyeing. So his recipe, his reference must be observed in a way with a critical eye. For example, he says that he tried more than 20 times to find the exact recipe, and at the end he could see that these difficulties plus the prices of lac dye did not justify, let's say, the an advantage or replacing cochineal for lac dye. However, I found this fact interesting. The last part, the final part of his recipe, his account of lac dye, ends by saying that it is actually possible to extract this color simply by grinding it, putting in a bag and water, and then leave it to extract. And then he said the intelligent dyer will know how to improve upon it. So once again, the experience was at the end probably the most important thing to practice with this dye. Then later on, by the end of the century, the East India Company hire Edward Bancroft for the manufacture of a powder lac dye, a ready to use and easy possibly to use powder to dye in Europe. So this dye was produced in Asia and then traded. And then we have this other important source by the end of the 19th century, Grison. It has various recipes, but the most important thing is that this source marked the introduction of early synthetic dyes, in this case orange 4. So this wealth of information show how the richness and variety on recipe for dyeing with lac dye. So the study of written sources is just a step of a bigger interdisciplinary methodology to study lac dye color that also includes a database of reference material, accurate reconstruction, and analytical study. So a database is important. Creating the database was important for us to have, first of all, a hands-on experience on this dyeing. And to do so, we created a recipe that brought together the historical sources and contemporary one, because we know that still there is a tradition of dyeing with lac dye in Asia with in fact, traditional ways. And so we collaborated with all these dyers. We decided to use these ingredients, the raw material and the powder, and we created this database of 100 samples. And here is just a way to show you the variety of color, from light pink to crimson to a deep red, but also to obtain this shift of color from crimson to red. In the analytical part, we are specifically using two techniques, one called fluorescence spectroscopy that allows us to obtain information on the dyeing formulation, the ingredients, and this other one called HPLC with mass spectrometry that gives us information, or will give us information on lac dye, different lac dyes obtained from various species, Scaria species. So there's still something to understand about lac dye, and we will doing it by understanding better the impact of the tin mordant, so go through the historical reconstruction in depth. Optimize this scientific methodology. The aging will be also taking into account to study better the case studies. And with this, it's all.